Hello everyone, and welcome to another one-off on this channel. Now, when I was going through the lists of stuff that was backlogged, I found something that quite piqued my interest, and that is something I ran across a few years ago while going through various OSTs that I listened to on YouTube while editing my videos. And this production is Mezame no Hakobune. Now, this is translated as Arc of Awakening, and it's also known as Open Your Mind, that's the international title, and it's a very odd 34-minute production that was originally made for the Aichi Expo of 2005. Now, basically what that is a world fair. It was held in Aichi, Japan for a few months, and this production was made specifically for it by renowned filmmaker Mamoru Oshii. I believe that's how it's pronounced. Now, to people familiar with the medium of anime, that name might be recognizable as the guy who was the driving force behind the creation of both Ghost in the Shell and Patlabor, although he's worked on many other productions, and we've even looked at a more obscure work of his on the channel, that of the art movie Angel's Egg. Now, I mention this because Open Your Mind is kind of similar to Angel's Egg, in that they're both very loose narratives that rely heavily on symbolism and atmosphere to convey certain points to the viewer, and certain points that may not necessarily be clear to the viewer. You have to kind of bring your own interpretation to what's going on, although there is a loose narrative here, and it is more coherent than Angel's Egg, which, while relatively coherent depending on who you ask, is not known for its literal storytelling ability. It's a symbolic work, and this is, while also symbolic, not necessarily as symbolic. I mention all of this because this is one of the oddest productions I've seen on this channel. It's a very unique production, and even though it's only 34 minutes, it definitely warrants discussion, and it definitely feels like something much larger than it actually is. And it is in a literal sense too, for production reasons we'll get into. Anyways, Open Your Mind was created for the Aichi Expo as mentioned, and since the theme of that expo had to do with protecting the environment of the world and acting in more ecologically friendly ways, the piece has an ecological theme about it. And we can see this in the acts that take place, and the general scenery and imagery present. With this all set up, let's get into what actually happens in Mezame no Hakobune. Now, this is a 34-minute production broken into several acts, all chronicling various stages of life on Earth. When we first open the film, we get this little prologue which shows the kind of origins of the building blocks of life on Earth, i.e. Earth very early on in its life is bombarded with comets from space which contain water, which eventually form an ocean and thus allow life to form. And this soon gets into the first act of the film, these odd anthropomorphic creatures standing in a forest. This feeds into Act 2, which kind of is just a nice relaxing overview of some life in the ocean and how full of life the Earth itself is. This then picks up into a more fast-paced act, which follows the birds in the sky as they travel across the world, and as they even go through an industrial zone, I guess, showing the impacts of human pollution upon the world. The idea of humanity negatively impacting the environment is further expounded upon in the next act, where we see the theme of science going too far, of people challenging the natural order too much, and of people just playing God, if you will. And we see this in the tragic creation of Dog Horse Pig, I'll call him, which is probably one of the most controversial aspects of this production. I've heard that it actually created quite a stir when it first came out, although for reasons I'll get into later, I don't think it's that controversial. Anyways, as we see the impact of humans trying to play God and the unfair creation of such odd chimeras, we get back into the forest that we started in, although now it is empty, and the production ends on a somber note. Basically, the whole theme of the production is Earth is beautiful, it has a lot of life, but it also must be protected, and that humanity cannot go too far lest it risk destroying the beautiful nature of life, of the beautiful nature of the world, and therefore life itself, and therefore themselves. And this all, of course, fits into the ecological themes present in the 2005 Aichi Expo. Now, getting into the expo itself, or at least some of the logistical things that I was talking about earlier, when I said the production feels a lot larger than it is, I meant that in a literal sense too, because while most people will probably watch this production in a standard format now, i.e. on your phone, or maybe you're projecting it to a TV, or you're watching it on your computer, that was not how this production was originally meant to be viewed. In fact, one of the whole center points of the production was the creation of a so-called 3D stage. And what I mean by that is it wasn't just a simple screening. It wasn't just a simple screen where you could watch the production. Instead, a floor screen was used in addition to various screens around the room and screens elsewhere to create a truly unique, and I would even go as far to say 3D filming experience. Now, while you can't recreate this by just watching the film on your computer or phone, and while I'm sure it has a lot to it, I don't necessarily think that watching it in a standard format really deducts from it, although I do think it's a very interesting side note, as the use of multi-level displays, including a floor panel and a bunch of screens, and the odd choice of a 1:33 video aspect ratio, as well as the fact that all the screens were kind of synchronized, really does create a unique theming experience that, while I never saw, I think it would be cool to see. I mean, it's obvious that a lot of work went into this, and that it is an art piece. And I think that's what we should see it as, because when I watched this for the first time, it's not really a movie, you know, it's only 34 minutes, and it's not an anime, like, series or anything. One could even argue that it's not even really, like, a story, because the narrative is pretty loose and pretty zoomed out, i.e. it's more about a theme, it's more about ideas than, like, characters per se. And that's also why I compared it to Angel's Egg earlier, because like Angel's Egg, this is a esoteric piece of art with a core theme that it wants to get at, but it does so in a very symbolic way, it does so in a very interpretive way, it does so in a way that lets the viewer kind of do a lot of the heavy lifting mentally and ask questions about what is this supposed to be, how am I supposed to feel, as opposed to having a clear story where things happen in a linear order. Now, I guess it could be said that there is sort of a linear order here, because again, it's about the evolution of life and humanity's degradation of the environment. However, there is no main character, there's no real main narrative, it's just a loose compilation of scenes telling about the environment of the world and humanity's possible impact on it. Is this good? I think it's fine as far as what it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be an art piece, and while it does have slower moments, it is entertaining, and the sheer uniqueness of it kept me watching throughout the entire 34 minutes. It did feel larger than 34 minutes in both better and worse senses. While the visuals are cool, there are several minutes throughout the film where it is just a still screen, or a still shot with like a ripple effect over it. It's not always moving, and even when there is movement, it's not always the most engaging. I mean, part 2 is probably the most engaging in terms of movement. It kind of feels like you're on like a ride even, and it did even make me a little motion sick. I mean that as a compliment to say that it did a good job simulating motion. I felt like I was moving in better senses. It feels like something that wants to get at the grass scope of the environment and of humanity's place in it. And I think that a lot of the filming does a good job doing it, especially in the second scene where we can see all the life in the ocean, and the use of a sort of void in the middle makes it feel infinite. It makes us feel small and makes us realize that we're just part of a larger system, i.e. the world, and the world is part of an even larger system, you know, the universe, so on and so forth. It makes you feel small and appreciate the grand scope of things. When I say small, I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean that in a wanderlust kind of way, where you realize just how infinite and wondrous the world can be. And in this way, the first 15 minutes of the film did elicit a lot of positive emotions from me. And I think this is done intentionally so that the last 15 minutes of the film can make us realize, like, maybe we should tone down or at least monitor our interactions with the environment, because it is something that's beautiful, and if we overuse it or we abuse it or we just disregard it, unpleasant things can happen. And that's where we get into the place of Dog Horseman, as I mentioned earlier. Now, in the film, it's shown that this tragic creature is the creation of human genetic manipulation, of some kind of scientific experiment gone wrong, and that it is a sad creature suffering from the unnatural state of its being. And I don't think it's supposed to be anything malicious. I don't think it's supposed to be anything malevolent. I think it's just supposed to be a tragic creature suffering the consequences of humanity going too far in a few places. In this way, he or she is sort of the manifestation of humanity pushing the bar too far, of taking advantage of the environment too much, of just simply not showing any regard for it like it should. I don't think this is any kind of specific commentary on genetic engineering or cloning. I don't think he's calling anyone out in specific for trying to create a man-dog-horse hybrid. Instead, I think it's just an abstract criticism of man outrunning the environment, or man going too far against the environment, and man just not taking the environment seriously. It's just a sort of warning to us not to play God, because, as mentioned earlier, we are just small parts of a really large system. For this reason, while the dog segment of the film is, I would at least consider, relatively disturbing, like I could see how someone could be like legitimately disturbed by it, especially considering how relaxing the first like 10 minutes are. I don't necessarily think it a bad part of the film. It's supposed to be disturbing. It's supposed to make us question how we use science and what we decide to do with our resources in the world. And the dog is portrayed as a tragic victim of us not doing so in the most wise nature. For this reason, while I can understand the creation of a dog-human hybrid being controversial, it seems to me like it's supposed to be. I don't think he's advocating for this to happen. I think he's advocating for people to wisen up and to pay attention to developments in the world so that tragedies like that don't happen. It's fine. It is a little disturbing, I will admit, but it's supposed to be in order to get its point across. And I think the point of the movie does come across quite clear, and that is just a sort of commentary on the vast nature of the universe and of life itself, and of humanity's duty to respect that and try to work within more eco-friendly confines to preserve what we have left and ensure that the world can live on much longer than it would should we use it irresponsibly. And these, of course, are my main thoughts on the film. It's a 34-minute drama with a loose narrative telling us to respect the environment. However, that is not, of course, all I have to say about the film. Because while the visuals are beautiful, and I did go over a little bit about how unique they were, if they were viewed as intended, I've purposely left out what I consider to be the strongest point of this production, and that is the 34-minute soundtrack. Now, the soundtrack is done by Kenji Kawai, who, if you're familiar with the works of Mr. Oshii, you should also be familiar with his works, as they've collaborated to do music for such pieces as Ghost in the Shell, Patlabor, and many other pieces. Now, Mr. Kawai's musical style is well known for using both futuristic and electronic sounds, and more folk sounds. He likes using the Japanese choir a lot, and this gives a lot of ethereal sounds to both his works, and especially to Mezame no Hakobune. I could listen to the soundtrack on its own. In fact, I think it's the main thing that keeps you watching. The visuals, again, are pretty symbolic, and there are a lot of shots that get stood on for a long time, and there's a lot of repeating sequences, and it's really the music that glues you to it, and it's really the music that is the strongest part of this production. And even if you have no interest in watching this odd art piece, I would recommend you listen to the music. It's genuinely great. And even if I don't know if I can say this production's genuinely great, it is one I'd recommend you watch if you just like weird stuff, because while I don't think it's bad, I don't necessarily think it's the most engaging thing either. If you like odd and obscure pieces, I would definitely recommend it, but I would recommend it in the way I would recommend, say, Angel's Egg, where you have to be okay with there not being a main character, really, or much dialogue. I don't really think there's any dialogue in this, or a neat, coherent narrative. It takes a more wide-lensed approach to things, and it's about a concept as opposed to characters or a solid, detailed plot. I do think it's very interesting, though, and I do think it is worth a watch, again, if you like art pieces. And I'm glad I watched it simply because it is one of the oddest things I've watched, and I mean it in the best way possible. To summarize it, I don't think that it's the best thing ever, but I do think it's pretty great. And I also wanted to give a shout out to my man, the Coelacanth. This guy appeared in Angel's Egg too, and when he showed up it put a big smile on my face. Because for some reason he keeps getting roles in these art films, so good for him. And good for Mezame no Hakobune for really standing out as a very odd, obscure memory. I don't even know if I would consider it anime. I mean, it is animated, but it is definitely an obscure memory, and it's definitely one I would recommend you check out, simply because of the weird nature of it and the fascinating behind-the-scenes stuff. Because while I did go over the production very briefly, or at least the floor diorama very briefly, the actual setup of it is fascinating, and you could probably make a 20-minute video on the actual production of it alone. So it's not the best production, but it is very interesting, and it does have a coelacanth. So, yeah, I'd watch it.